Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to my talk. It's been a great conference so far with the talks we had so far. My talk is titled React is 18 now. 18 is a nice age. That's the age that we start demanding answers from React and start asking React, okay, what are you going to do with your life? I'm Liad, I'm the lead front-end architect in Duda, and I'm also an analog astronaut, meaning that I do analog missions, space missions, in deserts around the globe. And for that, we're going to switch a little bit the theme of this presentation into dark mode. That's better. Okay, so when we start talking about React 18, we need to start speaking about React 17. React 17 was a release of no new changes. So we expected that React 18 will bring some changes, but actually this is what React 18 looks like. It's a whole lot of new changes, new paradigms, new mindsets that we need to understand in order to understand where React is going. So let's do a really quick 20 plus something adventure and start to understand, okay, where React is going. So in my previous talk a few years ago, I gave this slide, which is the Netflix of front-end development with all the things that you can learn in order to know front-end. But you know, since then, a lot has changed. Disney Plus came into our life. So we can't really talk about the Netflix of front-end development. And since React is a library, it's only fitting that we'll go into more of a book theme, right? So let's dive into React 18. First chapter, where we start to understand just how messed up the situation is. Okay, so React starts us slow. You can say even in a baby step. And there's a cool tweet by Kitze that says that, okay, if you try to ask DALL-E to generate new React architecture, this is what you get. So let's start talking about the new features in React 18. So the first one, maybe the most understandable one, is automatic batching. And when we talk about automatic batching, this is what we usually mean. We mean that if we have several state changes in one event handler or in one callback, we don't expect React to do all of those state changes one after one. We expect it to do batching. How will it look like without batching? If we do all of those state changes without batching, then React will do each of them and then do a render after each of them. So we'll do the set color blue, then we'll get this thing, set letter B with an apple, and then set image banana, and that's going to be very confusing for all of our babies. But luckily for us, React knows to do automatic batching, which knows to take all of those state changes and do them all at once. Now, React 17 already does that, but it doesn't do it in async callbacks. And React 18 now does it in async callbacks as well. So I can do some async function then, or set timeout, and I will get the automatic batching that I need. To opt in for that, we need to use React 18. We need to tell React 18, hey, I want to use those features. We can't just do React DOM.render like we're used to. We have to do something else. So we need to create a root. So instead of doing React DOM render, we're just taking the container and we define it as root. We tell React 18, okay, this is your root, and we'll understand later why it needs that. And now you can render the app. What happens if automatic batching does problems? If you want to opt out of it, then you can just use Flash sync with my first dead joke. You can just do flash sync in order to opt out of this behavior. You just wrap your code in flash sync, something like that. And then React will know that this state change is not going to be batched. So it's going to run this state change and then render and then run the other state changes. Okay, automatic batching, that was easy, right? No big news so far, but React 18 brings some new super esoteric hooks. And usually I would put here a GIF of shut up and take my money, but it's really more of a skeptical GIF, because why do we need these kind of hooks? We'll start with UseID. UseID comes to solve a very common or uncommon problem. Let's say you want to build some sort of this form, asking your baby why is it crying. And as you can see, the third one is the unexpected strike that happened today, which makes you think either I updated it this morning or I built the presentation yesterday, but no, I just updated this morning. So you want to do some sort of a checkbox component, right? And accessibility first. So if you build a checkbox component, you want to have some sort of a common ID for the label and the input of the checkbox, right? So you do something like that. You do generate ID, then you give the same ID for the label and the input, but then you'll have a problem with SSR. Because when you run this code in the server will say, that's one ID. And when you run the same code in the client in hydration, the client will generate another random ID. And these won't match. So React won't really know what to do with it, right? It will try to hydrate, but it will get different IDs. And so it will look like that. So React 18 now gives us use ID. It's a new hook. It's stable across the client and the server. And it contains a colon, so you can't use it in CSS, which makes it a little bit not usable. But that's one hook that we get. Okay, nice. The next hook that we're going to talk about is use sync external store. That's a mouthful, and it's also a little bit hard to understand why we need it, but we'll dive into it. And in order to demonstrate why we need it, let's say we build some sort of a store, right? Hooks are us, with all of the hooks needs for your baby, everything that your baby might need with hook. And if we build this kind of store, we definitely want to use some sort of a cart, right? Cart state. So we'll have a cart items component, which will display all the cart items where we listen to a cart store, maybe a Mobic store or something like that, and we'll display those components. But we also want the cart total. And note that the cart total uses the same code as our cart items, right? This part, the part that listens to the store, that's the same code as the cart items. So the reasonable thing to do is just to extract it to a hook called useStore. That's what we'll do, where in this hook, we'll have the state that gets the state from the store. And then we have the use effect, which is the listener that will listen to changes in the store. No more, because we can use sync external store for some reason. I mean, it was a good solution. Why do we need this use sync external store? But let's see what it means. So in use sync external store, you can just use this hook, this new hook, in order to provide React a way to subscribe to a store, a way to get the value from the store, and a server snapshot that we'll see in a second. So you need to provide a way for React to subscribe to changes in the store. You need to provide a way for React to get the value from the store. And the third thing is that you need to tell React what is the value that your server rendered in the SSR. Why? Same problem as before. If in the SSR it will get a certain value, and in the hydration it will get another value, then React won't know how to do the hydration. So you have to provide a server snapshot if you do SSR. So now you can use this hook safely whenever you need to connect to an external store. Just do use sync external store, and then give it the subscribe and the selector, and it will work, and it's super, super cool. And it doesn't really have to be a store. You can do it to connect to any external data source, even a window resize listener. See, this is super easy. You just give it the subscriber, and then you do the second argument is the selector, how to get the width, and the third one is the SSR. And that seems too much. Why do we need it? We'll see in a second. But through recap using sync external store, it allows easy registration to stores, and it's fully controlled by React, and we need to remember to set the server value. But why? We'll see later on. Second dead joke. Okay. Let's talk about use insertion effect. Use insertion effect, another new hook that we get. A little recap about use effect. So use effect accepts a function that will run on every complete render, right? So if we do code like that, we want to render Mars and then put an astronaut on it, and we use it in use effect. So React will render Mars, the browser will paint Mars, and only after that, it will put the astronaut on it, which is nice. We got use layout effect a few versions ago, which runs before that. So it runs after the DOM mutation, but before paint, right? So if we put the astronaut in use layout effect, then React will render Mars, but the browser won't paint it yet. Yeah, and then we'll put the astronaut there. And now we get use insertion effect, which runs even before use layout effect, and it fires before all the DOM mutations, and you can use it if you want to inject styles to your DOM. So if you do something like that, then the use insertion effect will run before anything is even rendered to the browser. Okay, so that's something that you need to remember. Okay, so we can see that the order is going to be preserved. Almost. If we do use insertion effect, use layout effect, use effect, we will see something like that, right? This is what we expect. But in React 18, we'll also see another fire of use layout effect and another fire of use effect, which makes you wonder, why is my code running twice? Why are my effects running twice? And if you're running in development mode, if you just did create React app, it's going to surprise you, because React gives us strict mode. And strict mode, that's the default when you do create React app. And you can wrap parts of your tree in strict mode in order to opt in to whatever it guards you from. And it guards you from a lot of bad things like component with unsafe life cycles or legacy API usages. But what we're interested in is the last thing here, ensuring reusable state. And that's something that strict mode is doing since now. And you might ask yourself, okay, what does it mean? Why does it do that? Because in the future, React will have the possibility to remove part of the component tree and then remount them again using the same state. So just think about tab switches when you want in your application to move between tabs. You don't want to re-render and reset the state of every tab all the time. React can do in the future, it can unmount the previous tab, and then when you go back to it, it will remount it and use the same state that was before. So for that, the components should be resilient to be mounted and remounted and destroyed, and this is what strict mode is going to protect us from. But it will run even on our first mount effect. So even if you do empty dependency array, for example, this set interval will run twice. So it will increase by 2 every second. So a possible solution for that is to keep a ref for first render and just check if that's my first render, and then if so, I can run it, if not, not. But it's not really a good solution because if you have a very heavy use effect, you don't really want to run it twice. So it's not a good solution, and the reactions on the web weren't that subtle. I'm starting to give up React strict mode. React strict mode in V18 is bad. The reactions weren't that good, but then our prophet Dan Abramov said that the correct solution is just to embrace double firing. So React, a tool that's supposed to help us, is saying, okay, just embrace it that I'm going to fire your code twice, even if you don't want to. But okay, this is the reason, and this is the reason Dan Abramov gave us. So this brings us to the second chapter, where we start to understand that the rabbit hole is a little bit deeper than we thought. It's not just nice, fancy hooks. We have a lot of problems here. We'll start talking about Concurrent React. And Concurrent React is a complete rewrite of React rendering engine. And here this GIF works because it's super exciting. React is working on that for a long time. For every React conf, they started with async React, and then concurrent mode, and now concurrent features. They worked for it actually since 2016, meaning for over 2,000 days, they've been trying to make this happen, this concurrent mode, and they had a lot of features on the way that meant to support it. Hooks were meant to support it, error boundaries, all of this supporting concurrent mode. Concurrent mode, in a nutshell, is a way to solve UX problems of CPU or I/O intensive app, which allows you, like you probably know, to render parts of the trees in different urgencies or in different times. So, for example, if you type something in a text box and you want the text box to be super responsive, then concurrent mode will allow you to do that. It allows you to work on multiple tasks and then switch between them according to priority. So, without concurrent mode, React has to render everything one by one. So, if it has a very complex tree, it needs to render everything, and if there's an urgent DOM change, React can't do anything with it, right? Without concurrent mode. It has to complete render, and even if it's a very long DOM tree, even if there's an urgent animation, React can't do anything with it, and now it has to complete the tree, and this is just to simulate how heavy it's going to be to render all of it, and only then it's done. With concurrent mode, React renders everything, but it can also, if there's an urgent animation that the thread needs to do, it can also pause rendering and then do the animation and then continue rendering the tree. And if there's an urgent user input that changes this tree, React can go back to the start if it needs and then render everything, continue from where it stopped, right? And only then it commits it to the DOM. So the difference between Stack Reconciler, which is what we had before Fiber, is that everything runs sequentially. Fiber Reconciler, it can just render parts of your DOM in different times according to needs, and only when it's ready, committing it to the DOM. And it does that by partially rendering a tree without committing the result by throwing promises up. So elements or components that are not ready can say to React, hey, I'm not ready yet. Like I said, hooks was designed for concurrent mode, which is pretty impressive that the React team did all of those things just to prepare us to concurrent mode. And in order to opt into concurrent mode, we need to create a route like we saw earlier. It will create a different behavior with our components, even though that we're not supposed to see it. And now we can use some cool things like use deferred value. And for use deferred value, we take this example. Let's say we want to do some sort of a photo search where we type something in a text box, and then we do a search of photos while we type, okay? So this is very simple code. We have an onChange when the text field changes, and it changes both the text field and the search query for the photo card. And the problem is that we can't separate both, because the first one is urgent. We want the text field to be responsive, and this one is not urgent because we want the photo search to happen only when React has time. So now it looks like that. When I type something, the user won't see it until the filter will finish, right? So you see the text box is not that responsive. But now we can use deferred value. And if we do use deferred value on a state value, we can tell React, hey, this deferred query is not that important. You can deal with it later, right? So this is urgent because it's using the state variable query. This is not urgent because it's used deferred query. And now it will look like that. When you type, then you see that the text box is super responsive, and the filter will happen only once the user stops typing, which is nice. So start transition is something that we also get in React 18. It's similar to use deferred value, but it can mark low priority state changes. For that, we need to split our state. So if you want to use start transition here, we need to split our state to the urgent state and the not urgent state. And then we tell React, hey, when a change is happening, set the photo title because that's the urgent change that we want, but do the search query thing in transition, meaning that it's low priority. So this is urgent, this is not urgent, which is nice. You can see here that without transition, note that the input, the slider, when you move it, the slider gets stuck because it takes a lot of time to render this huge tree, so it's not responsive, and only when it's done render, only then it releases. And with transition, you can note that the slider is responsive even though the rendering of the tree is not done yet. Okay, this is nice, and you might ask yourself, is it possible to know when a transition is in progress? So is it possible to know when the transition is going to end? So yes, we can use transition. That's a new hook that React 18 gives us. And use transition just gives us the same start transition that we used before, but also a variable called isPending, or a flag, that we can use in order to know that the transition is still going. So this will be true until the transition is done, so we can do grayed out or disabled parts of our DOM. So now we understand the problem with the stores, right? Because if React can stop rendering and resume rendering whenever it wants, so if our componentry is looking at a third party or an external store, we're in the risk of tearing, of inconsistencies in our UI, because some parts of our UI will look at a certain value and another parts at a different value. So for example, if I have a store or a store here for whoever is counting dead jokes, and we want to render a hero name and hero image, and they're looking at the store, and React renders the hero name because there's Thor in the store, and then it pauses, and then the store changes, and now React renders the hero image, then this is what we're going to happen. This is called tearing, and it's not a good thing. And use sync external store allows us to bail out of it. Okay, so now we get to chapter 3, where we understand that React is not the same React that we knew so far. It has changed, and for that we need to talk a little bit about suspense and lazy. So a suspender is a part of the render tree that can pause render for any reason. It can either wait for code or wait for data, and you're probably familiar with lazy and cache, but just a quick recap. If I have Earth and Mars, and I want to render Mars only if Elon Musk is present, then I can wrap it with lazy and suspense, and it would look like that. And I can also move suspense up the tree, and then I'll have a spinner on everything, not just Earth and Mars. And then you ask yourself, okay, is it just a glorified spinner? No, that's a mind shift in how React is rendering, and it can also work on data. So to recap quickly, time slicing is what we saw is rendering which is not blocking, and using suspense is a way to access async data or async components without pausing the rendering of the tree. And Kent mentioned it in his talk, but I'm going to talk about it for a few seconds. React 18 gives us Suspense SSR, and as you know, in SSR we have the problem of SSR waterfalls. So we have to render everything in the server, send it to the client, and then render everything in the client. So I'll use my mentor example. Let's say you build some sort of a mentorship website, where you have all of the Avengers and they can be your mentors, and you want to have a mentor page with image and title and reviews on the mentor. So it would look like that, right? It's super easy. Name, image, description, reviews. And if you try to do SSR for it, again, it works because the server takes this JSX, creates the markup, sends it to the client, React does its hydration, and everything works. But what if you want to use Suspense? What if you want the reviews or the image to be async loaded? Then it's a problem, because if you wrap everything in Suspense and then you try to do SSR, then the server won't know what to do in the Suspense part because it doesn't have the data. So React won't know what to do in the client. But React 18 brings us new features, streaming HTML and selective hydration. Again, can't touch it. We can use it with those APIs, so I won't dive into it. But streaming HTML means that whenever the server tries to do SSR with Suspense, it will create a placeholder here, will send it with the placeholder to the client. React will do the hydration, and only when it's ready, the server will send the updated part, and then we'll see it in the client. And it can also do selective hydration, meaning that if the user clicks on something that is not ready, React will know to prioritize it and then hydrate it before it hydrates the rest, which is nice. Okay, now we get to chapter 4, when we start to see some cracks in the perfection of React, right? Because that was a little bit confusing. That was a little bit confusing, and I'm guessing a lot of you thinking, okay, how am I using this? And now it's a good question. Do you still recommend React for someone who's just starting to get into the front-end development? I'm not so sure, because React is becoming hard. The mental model of React is becoming hard. It's hard to understand where is it going. And now we're going to talk about some problems in React and our nemesis, hydration. So hydration, which is what I mentioned a few times. Let's talk a little bit about what does it mean to hydrate. So there are a few ways to give life to the markup when the server renders it. First of all, there's native browser interactions. This is what Remix is really good at. So if you send to the browser native dropdowns and native forms and native checkboxes, the browser knows what to do. You don't need JavaScript. There's also a way of sending the JavaScript to the browser, and then it's called JavaScript-based interactions. But what React is doing is that you send the markup, then you send React. React regenerates the markup in the client, regenerates the same markup that we have, and does the hydration, and only then it's interactive. So with React, we need to send it to the client, the rendering code and the interaction code, which makes you wonder, if all we need is this is the interaction code, why do we need to send all of this to the client? Because this is what React forces us to do. So hydration is becoming a problem. You have to send all the rendering code, and you can't really partially hydrate, and it's becoming a problem. Because when you think of it, when you think about SSR, about how we can do SSR, so it's not just server-side rendering and client-side rendering. We used to think of this dichotomy, but it's a spectrum, right? You have static rendering and client-side apps, but in the middle, you might have incremental static regeneration and real-time server-side rendering and React server components. There's a spectrum there, and now we have edge rendering, which is using not just the server, but also an edge network, right, in order to serve or stream things to the client. So for example, if I have a client here, I don't have to go all the way to the server if I have an edge network. So if I have some sort of an edge network, I can just ask the page from the edge, and there will be edge rendering on the edge, and it will bring me the page without having to go to the server. But the problem with edge rendering, it will allow string, but it requires an edge network. It requires a framework. It requires Remix or Next or something to work. So this amazing Suspense SSR, that's a feature that we can't really use unless we have a framework. Also, use effect is becoming a problem. And I don't know if you saw 2 weeks ago, our prophet, Dan Abramov, said, you might not need use effect. Dan Abramov posted a tweet that says, you don't need use effect. Use effect, that's like the epitome of hooks, right? And there's a long page of all the use cases for use effect, where Dan Abramov shows how you can use anything else other than use effect in order to use these use cases. And then you ask yourself, okay, then why do we have this hook? And David Khorshid is going to have a great talk in this conference called Goodbye Use Effect about the problems in use effect and why we can't really use it the way we want to use it. It was a funny response by Brian Vaughan saying, okay, eventually we'll write a post for each of the APIs and then have a collection. You might not need React, which is probably where it's headed. Because some problems with use effect, for example, is that if I have this use case, I want to log whenever a route changes, right? So I have use effect that I'm logging analytics, I'm doing the route that changed and current user.name, and I'm watching the route URL for changes, then ESLint will yell at me and will say, hey, you didn't put current user.name in the dependency, right? I mean, am I right? It's going to do this thing. But if I'm adding current user, what will happen now? I will log to my analytics every time that the user changes their name. I will log a page visit event every time the user changes his name. How can I prevent this thing from happening? It's something that's baked in use effect. Or if I want to save a draft for my text every 1,000 milliseconds, if I do something like this, because I'm putting my text in the dependency list, I will reset the interval on every text change. So every time someone changes the text, I will reset the interval to send it to the server. And if I remove it, then this code will always see stale text if text is not in the dependency list. So React is working on a great RFC called useEvent, where you don't really need dependency list. You can just do something like this. So you define useEvent of saving the draft. You don't provide dependency list, but it knows to look at the updated value of the text. And then in your use effect, you just use onTick, which is nice, and it's magic. And you ask yourself, why? Why do we need this magic? I mean, come on, React. Why do you need to keep inventing new hooks just for us to do our jobs? And there was a great reply by one of the Solid creators saying, in Solid.js, this is how useEvent looks. You just run the same function. And you can't really talk about the problems in React without mentioning Solid and what's happening today on the web. It's the equivalent of a meme of someone who is holding React hands but looking back to Solid. You remember that meme? Because Solid is the new kid in town, it's the cool kid in town. It doesn't need a dependency array, it's fully reactive. It works with JSX. I'm pretty sure that next year is going to be like a Solid Next conference. Because look how easy it is in Solid to create state, create effect. You don't need to handle dependency changes. And performance-wise, it's amazing. It's the fastest frameworks, and it sends the fewest code to the client. And it makes you think, if you need these kind of frameworks to solve React problems, it makes you think, okay, React is 18. Now what? Where are you going with it? And the React team, the React Labs team, is working on a lot of amazing features like server components and SSR optimization and off-screen rendering and asset loading and a lot of really cool things that we can't really wrap our head around because explaining modern React looks like that now. If you try to explain React to a newcomer with all of those new things, with the mental models of concurrent rendering and suspense and everything, it looks like that. Because React started as the promising kid in town, but it got really complicated to the point that you can't really use its features unless you have some sort of a framework, unless you're using Remix, unless you have a server somewhere, unless you have an edge network. But you can relax because as an application developer, you don't need to worry about any of it because React is actually addressing now framework developers or library developers, so you don't really need to worry. You will have frameworks that will cover all the bad parts for you. And if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, then I'll recommend my recommendation of going back to the Netflix of web development and just watching a nice, relaxing episode of hooks, of familiar hooks. And just remember that the future is going to be amazing. Eventually, we're going to get it right. You're awesome. And I was Liad Yosef. Thank you very much.